For over 3 decades, the brutal murder of John Sumpter and the attack and murder of his sister Pamela Sumpter went unsolved. For over 3 decades, the person responsible walked free, thinking the passage of time had erased the events that took place on July the 15th of 1990. But in 2023, Pamela Sumpter was finally able to identify her killer and the man who had raped her. Through a rape kit, where evidence was collected back when the offense occurred, she was able to identify one man, and that man is Kenneth Perry. Today, we start the process of holding him accountable for those horrific crimes and for providing justice to the Sumpter family, who has lived in a nightmare ever since. I have to take you back to an apartment complex at 2702 Tree Hills Parkway on July the 15th of 1990. There, in the early morning hours on that day, Pamela Sumpter awoke in her bedroom to a man in her room, an intruder, someone she did not invite to be there. This man was naked, he was armed with a knife, and he proceeded to forcibly rape Pamela, strangle her, and stab her multiple times. Pamela was fortunate to survive that initial assault. Unfortunately, her brother was not. When the attack was over, Pamela tried to go to the other bedrooms, try to find a phone. You'll hear that the phone cords had been cut throughout the home. She made her way down the stairs, and as she passed her living room, she saw her brother's lifeless body on the ground. She made her way to the neighbors next door to try to get help. And when the neighbors came out, they'll tell you that they found her in nothing but a t-shirt, covered in blood. She was very upset. She said that she had been raped and that she had been stabbed and that she believed her brother was deceased next door. She tried to tell them everything she could, even asking Mr. Washington, her neighbor, to get something and write it down. It was very important that she gave her story. She was able to describe the attacker, and she told the Washingtons that her brother, who is gay, brought this man home the night prior, that he had brought him home after driving around town, going out to a club, and that she was at home watching TV. Her brother seemed comfortable with the man, but she started to feel uncomfortable and had gone upstairs and gone to bed. This man told her a name. She believed it was Eddie or Al. She was able to provide his description, his approximate age. She recalled him saying that he was from Detroit and that he might be living in the Lithonia area. All of this information Pamela told to everyone she encountered, her neighbors, the responding officers, the doctors who treated her initially at the hospital. She made sure that she provided all the information she had to identify this unknown person who had attacked her and killed her brother. Now, at the hospital, there was a valiant effort to save Pamela's life. She underwent multiple surgeries to repair the lacerations to her body from the stab wounds, her dislocated shoulder from the fight, and the surgical intervention to repair the tears to her vagina because of the brutal assault that she had endured. And after the surgery, Pamela was able to speak to a detective in the case, but that was the last statement that she gave. Not long after, she was intubated She fought for 2 weeks, a little more than 2 weeks, and ultimately succumbed to her injuries on August the 5th of 1990. A little bit later that morning, on July the 15th of 1990, officers located a vehicle that belonged to the Sumpters that had been taken after the assault, believed by the person who had assaulted Pamela and murdered John. It was a rental car. It was a rental car that the Sumpters' other brother had helped them get. It was taken from the home and later that morning located in the Lithonia area at 6850 Magnolia Street. It was found abandoned in a vacant lot in Lithonia right next to a woodline. And this is going to be important later, so take note. That vehicle was photographed and it was processed for fingerprints. And then back at the apartment, police were doing everything they could to preserve evidence and to try to identify this suspect. You'll hear how the apartment was videoed, the state that it was found in. Photographs were taken of every room, of all the evidence that was collected. And they processed the home for fingerprints and biological evidence, anything that they could use to try to identify who this person was. They looked for blood, they looked for semen, they looked for saliva. The police made valiant efforts to try to identify this person. But because John had just picked him up, he wasn't a known associate. No one knew who he was. And you'll hear that John was actually pretty private about his romantic life. So it wasn't really common for him to introduce men to his family anyway. Police could not figure out who this person was. And back in 1990, DNA casework was a little different. There wasn't a national database that you could take a offender sample from a crime scene or from a rape kit and upload and see if you got any investigative leads. That didn't exist in 1990 here in Georgia or really anywhere in the country. In order to utilize DNA evidence, you had to have a known suspect, a person whose DNA you could swab and compare it directly to the evidence you had collected. In this case, since we didn't have a suspect, Pamela Sumpter's rape kit was not processed to even see if it contained male DNA. But it was collected, and it was safely secured at the DeKalb County Police Department all these years, patiently waiting to tell the story of who that offender was. And that day finally came in 2023, when a federal grant allowed for a number of sexual assault kits to finally be processed, to be screened to see if there was even male DNA present. Pamela Sumpter's kit was one of those kits. After the screening, it was determined that there was male DNA in the vaginal swab from Pamela Sumpter's rape kit. With that information, in today's technology, we're able to upload that sample to a national database. And it did result in an investigative lead. An investigative lead that ultimately led investigators to Kenneth Perry. Now, Kenneth Perry, once he was identified as a potential suspect, it was then time to look into Kenneth Perry, to see if he might be the person who had attacked Pamela Sumpter and murdered John Sumpter. When they looked at Kenneth Perry, they were able to realize he was, in fact, from Detroit, Michigan. Pulled his birth certificate. That was the first check. They then were able to pull a photograph from just a few months after the offense, from October of 1990, and it matched the description provided by Pamela. He was the right age, the right complexion, the right body style, the right hair, right everything. They were also able to locate evidence showing that Kenneth Perry lived in Lithonia in 1990, that he was residing at 7047 Swiss Street in Lithonia, which happened to be less than half a mile from where the Sumpter's rental car was located, abandoned in that woodline. Once they had Kenneth Perry's description, they could place him as being born in Michigan. They could place him in Lithonia within months of this brutal attack, within half a mile of where the Sumpter's car was ditched in the woods. Investigators decided to look back at the evidence pulled from the crime scene and compare it directly to Kenneth Perry. First, they pulled the prints that were taken from the scene and from the car, and had those reanalyzed against Mr. Perry. And there were matches. The first to a plate that was found on the kitchen counter in the Sumpter's kitchen the day that the assault happened. The second to the downstairs bathroom doorknob. 2 prints belonging to Mr. Perry at the scene of the crime. At this point, investigators knew they had enough evidence to secure an arrest warrant of Mr. Perry and to ask a court for a sample of his DNA. Those warrants issued in June of 2024, and Mr. Perry was arrested. A sample of his DNA was collected, and it was compared to the vaginal swab profile that was found. And it was a match. Mr. Perry contributed the DNA that was found in the vaginal swab from Pamela Sumpter's rape kit. Now, you're going to hear from a number of DNA experts about this evidence. This is older evidence. It's 34 years old. I expect the defense is going to get up and try to convince you that it's no good, that it's degraded, and so it's therefore unreliable. But what the experts are going to tell you is quite different. They're going to tell you that they create reliable profiles from old, degraded DNA all the time. And it is reliable. Now, the process is a little different. The process of creating the profile is a little different. It looks a little different when you're working with an older sample or a sample that might have some degradation. But it still results in a reliable profile. And if it didn't, we wouldn't be spending millions of dollars around the country processing old sexual assault kits. What the DNA analysts are going to tell you is that degraded DNA can produce a reliable result. And in this specific case, if the level of degradation was very small. It wasn't even a concern of the analyst. And this profile is absolutely reliable. And in fact, the comparison that was performed in this particular case is about as run-of-the-mill as it gets. And that's what the evidence is going to show. Because of these facts, because of all of the evidence linking Mr. Perry to the scene, because he matches the description, because his evidence, his fingerprints are at the scene, his DNA is in the rape kit, Mr. Perry has been charged 34 years later with 2 counts of murder, 2 counts of felony murder, 4 counts of aggravated assault, 2 counts of aggravated battery, 1 count of rape, 2 counts of possession of a knife during the commission of a felony, and 1 count of death by taking. And these are charges, as you've heard, that the state has the burden of proving to each of you beyond a reasonable doubt. And we will meet that burden over the course of this trial by presenting you all of that evidence, by bringing you the witnesses who worked this case, the doctors who treated Pamela Sumpter, the medical examiners, the police officers, the detectives that worked the case and processed the scene, the scientists who evaluated the DNA evidence, the neighbors of the Sumpters and the family members of the Sumpters. They will all testify over the course of this week and maybe into next week. And at the end of the trial, once you've had a chance to receive all the evidence in this case, we're going to come back before you and we're going to ask you to return a verdict that is long overdue in this case. A verdict that will finally give the Sumpter family justice, that will hold this man accountable for what he did to John and Pamela Sumpter. A verdict of guilty on all counts. Thank you.
Mr. Queen?
Yes, Your Honor, thank you. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's okay. It's okay. A few more hours. I know it's been a long day already. You guys have been with the jury selection, and it seemed a bit tedious. But now you're here for the case itself. And as you've heard, it's a very serious matter. Ms. Hodder's giving you what she believes is a roadmap and what you're going to see. And I'm going to give you likewise a roadmap of what you're going to see, what you're going to hear in this case. The state of Georgia versus Kenneth Perry. This, ladies and gentlemen, is a case that hangs by two threads. One is DNA evidence. One is fingerprints. Now, the DNA evidence is clear, but it's not sufficient. The fingerprints, they're somewhat clear, but they're not sufficient. Because what ultimately you're going to hear and understand is that, yes, Kenneth Perry was at that address. Kenneth Perry was in that car. That's what you'll hear. And that's going to be uncontroverted. But ultimately, evidence will also show that Kenneth Perry did no harm to no one on July 15th, 1990. So let's talk about the evidence, what this case is all about. Basically, you're here, Pamela and John, brother and sister, who met a tragic, brutal death in July of 1990. You're hear about Kenneth Perry, who 30-some years later, was arrested at a pizza parlor, not far from here, and charged with this crime. But what you really want to hear about is how the state has failed to find the killer. Because you're going to hear that there are many, many issues and holes and flaws in the state's case. Some things are clear, but it doesn't tell you the whole picture. When you see the whole picture, you will be left with questions. And you'll be left with an answer as to why did the state believe that Kenneth Perry even did this. Some background. You understand that by now? You heard the indictment on yesterday? Tragic, brutal killing. That's uncontroversial. Years. The state just told you. Inaction. A rape kit that just sat on the shelf for years and years. But then what you hear is what? Prosecution based on part of the evidence. not all the evidence, not all the evidence the state has. You can hear a prosecution based on part of the evidence, the part that fits their theory, the part that fits their narrative. But once you hear the whole evidence, once you hear everything going on, then you have to think what really happened that night. Time out. July 1990, 15th, killings occurred. Around about March, preliminary hit. And Mr. Perry's DNA may potentially match what's found in that grave. In June, a few months later, I said Mr. Perry is arrested in Snellville. He's taken into custody. Immediately, he's indicted, and the case before you begins. Less than 10 months ago, and that brings us to now, when you must decide the evidence in this case, you must decide, is it sufficient? You're going to hear from groups of people, three primary groups of people: laypersons, family and friends of the Sumpters. They're going to give you some background information. You're going to hear from law enforcement, mostly retired officers who were around back in that day, back in 1990. You're going to hear from experts. And they're going to tell you about what those two little threads are: the DNA and the fingerprints. But I ask you to pay particular attention to what those DNA and what those fingerprints really mean. Because this ultimately is what you call a circumstantial evidence case. You will never hear from anyone, "I saw Kenneth Perry do this." You've already heard about nicknames. Nicknames don't subscribe to him. Aliases, nicknames that are not subscribed to him. You already heard about that. So what you have is this circumstantial evidence, this DNA. I asked a question about science. And we're not questioning the science. Contrary to what Ms. Hodbury believed, we're not questioning the science. We don't question that, yes, DNA found in Pamela Sumpter belongs to Kenneth Perry. We're not questioning that. But ultimately, no one can tell you when that DNA got there. No one can tell you under what circumstances it got there. We're grown adults here. Intercourse is not equal rape. And intercourse is not equal murder. And then, the fingerprints. We don't deny that Kenneth Perry was there. On a plate. In a car. You're not going to hear about his fingerprints on a knife. You're not going to hear about his fingerprints by the bed. You're not going to hear about his fingerprints near the body. That is what you're not going to hear. Because the state has done this. They've got some DNA evidence. And they've pushed this case forward. Except for also, there is other evidence. The state, the police back then collected bunches and bunches of items. They swabbed multiple items. They collected multiple items. When you look in those pictures, when you see the scene, you see the video, you see the photos, look at all the things there that have no connection with Kenneth Perry. They should. This is a brutal, brutal stabbing. You're going to hear about the struggle of two people fighting for their lives. But you will hear no evidence of Kenneth Perry's DNA being on anybody's face. You will hear no evidence of Kenneth Perry, any of his semen being found anywhere in the bed. Now there's stuff that the state could have done, but they chose not to. And what you're going to see is these two things which are hanging their head on. The description. Ms. Holler and I would beg to differ. Matching the description. Black male, yes. The complexions, we differ. The build, we differ. The height, the age range, we differ. So actually pay particular attention to those items when you hear them. Generalities from Michigan, from Detroit. That's where you hear generalities. Like I said, you're not going to hear Kenneth, Ken, K, Perry. You're not going to hear none of that. And ultimately, you got to decide, why did I not hear that? So this case is serious. It's real. The consequences are serious for everyone involved. But at the end of the day, ladies and gentlemen, it doesn't add up. Now, some housekeeping matters. The most important thing is, and you've done a great job so far, you gotta pay attention. There's a lot of minutia, there's a lot of details, a lot of little small things that mean something in this case. There's a lot of little small things that mean something in this case. And then one thing I always tell everybody, don't let us distract you. The state has multiple devices. I'm running 2-3 devices over there myself. Don't let us distract you. Because we have witnesses, we have people working behind the scenes for us, so we can get this case to you. So you can make the right decision when you render a verdict. So don't let us distract you. Indulge us for a few days. If you're a note taker, take notes. If you're not a note taker, I honestly do not recommend you start now. They say it takes 21 days to establish a new habit. Today should not be day one. So ladies and gentlemen, if you're a note taker, take notes. If you're not a note taker, please don't. And then, most importantly, when people say things, when you hear statements, more than likely you're going to hear them once. Which gets us back to number one. You actually pay attention. If you're going to hear it once, and you don't have an opportunity, if you can't ask, Judge, can I hear it later? Can I hear it again? Generally, you get to hear things once. But each little piece of evidence makes a difference. When you got to decide, does it cut this way? Does it cut that way? Again, please pay attention. Focus on your job in this case. And that's running the verdict which speaks the truth. So as I said, ladies and gentlemen, this is a case hanging on 2 threads. Some DNA, which doesn't improve rape, and doesn't improve murder, and some prints, which doesn't prove either as well. And yes, at a later point, probably next week, I'm going to ask you, cut those threads and find Kenneth Perry not guilty. Thank you.